Let's look to Genesis 12. We'll read from Genesis 12, from verse 10 through then into chapter 13. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And he was about to enter Egypt. He said to his wife, Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you are my sister, so I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. When Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abraham. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So I took her to be my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. Then we'll continue on into the next set of verses and chapter. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock, in silver and gold. From the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. I know the Lord will bless the reading of his word this morning. I'd like to share for you for a time this morning on the subject of living the faith life. Living the faith life. I want you to honestly answer me a question this morning. Not verbally, but stick up your hand if you understand what I'm saying. Have you ever been on your journey of faith with the Lord and you feel that your faith's beginning to falter? At least 4 or 5 of us are honest this morning. Of course it does. In every believer's journey of faith, there are going to be those moments when our faith falters or diminishes, or we struggle with what God has asked us to do. You could say that faltering faith is an inevitable result of our humanity. In our human weakness, of course, there's times we're going to have doubts and fears and anxieties, and our faith begins to wane or falter. But I'm glad to say that study the life of Abram or Abraham, and we can learn lessons for living the life of faith. Because Abram helps us to see the attitudes and choices that can encumber our journey of faith and possibly help us avoid those attitudes and choices so that we continue to live the faith life in all its glory and its strength for the Lord. We've got to remember, church, that the journey of faith is a process of maturity. And there are different stages within that process. Just as we are born and grow and the different stages of life up until adulthood and old age, so it is with our living faith. It's a process that continually is growing and maturing and changing. And God uses both successes and failures to mature us in that life of faith. Abram started his journey of faith in Ur, but along the way he was sidetracked, and he and his father Terah settled in Haran. It was in Haran that Abraham heard the summons of renewal, the summons of the second chance, if you like, and he responds in faith and continues on his journey until he ultimately makes it to Canaan, where God always had intended him to go. I guess you could say that Abraham at this moment is in the center of God's will, but that was soon to change. It would change because the trying circumstances would come to test Abraham's faith, and his faith unfortunately does falter. But the crash of Abraham's faith is not terminal, praise God. God in his faithfulness uses Abraham's failure to bless and to grow Abraham in his walk with God. And it's from these verses that we read this morning how I believe there are some lessons we can learn to live the life of faith. You ready to go this morning? Stay with me, because let's see how long it takes. If we don't get that finished today, we'll carry it over into next week. Here's the first lesson for us. Our faith matures in challenging circumstances. Listen to the words of that opening verse we read. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. You see, the challenging circumstance for Abraham is a famine that was told were very severe. The Hebrew word translated severe has the meaning of being burdensome or difficult. It was a very, very challenging experience for all who lived in that land at the time. Now look, it was not uncommon for this area in which Abram found himself to experience drought. The ecology of that region was very fragile because it depended on the rains that came in winter and in the spring months. And if the rains didn't come on time, they expected the crops to fail and something disastrous to happen if those winter and spring rains didn't happen. The harvest would be negatively affected. It would be a difficult circumstance for all who lived in the land. And this would become a challenge to Abraham's walk of faith. You realize the significance of Abraham's faith in the situation he's in, and it summons the life of faith in the verses that we read and some of the previous verses in those chapters. We said Abraham first heard the call of God while he was in his birthplace, Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram was to leave there and go to Canaan. Now, Canaan did not compare to Ur when it came to the luxurious lifestyle and comfort that he found there. Ur, you see, was a port city, fed by two great rivers, had rich soil to bring about great harvest every season. Canaan, on the other hand, where he was sent to, had a very sensitive ecology that from time to time would and could bring about famine at any time. The challenge to Abraham's journey of faith would be no doubt concerning the will of God. Can you imagine what Abraham thought? God says, go from Ur, where everything looks wonderful and prosperous, head into Canaan, and the next thing he knows, there's a famine there. Now, come on, would you not question the will of God? Would you not start to doubt, what am I doing? Has God given me a misdirection? Have I not heard from God properly? I imagine he was a lot like you and me, and he questioned the will of God for his life. I'm sure sometimes you have stepped out in faith, and when you've stepped out, then you think, have I made a mistake? Because this ain't working out the way I thought. Our tendency as humans, when we face that kind of challenge or circumstance, we begin to doubt the will of God. Because somehow we get the notion that if we're in the center of God's will, it means nothing challenging is going to happen. I'm walking with God, and everything's going to be wonderful. Well, you better start thinking again, because if I read the scriptures correct, that's not often what happens. On the contrary, God will often send us through challenging circumstances of life to mature us, to strengthen us, to build us up, to redirect us in the way he wants us to walk. We must recognize that the challenging circumstances that often come our way come from the hand of a sovereign God who's taking us on a journey with him. Remember, if you read some of the previous verses and the experience that Abraham had with God, God promised Abraham that he would take care of him and that he would bless him as he set out on the journey of faith that God told him to take. So here is Abraham trusting in the promises of God, but suddenly he finds it's not all that he expected. What's the lesson? Those of us as believers who are on the journey of faith must remember that we live in an environment in the world today that is challenging our life of faith. It's challenging us spiritually, it's challenging us physically, it's challenging us emotionally, and it challenges us mentally. This sinful world that we live in consumes the environment of the world around it that is good and prosperous and healthy. And in this sinful environment, we are going to face many challenges for the Christian faith for which we stand. And if you think that it's always going to be easy and we're not going to have to stand for our faith, then think again. The circumstances come to test us, to try us, and if we respond to the challenge with a whole heart trust in God, our faith will not falter, but we've got to be determined to go with God no matter what is happening in our lives. Not to let our faith falter, because that faith matures us in the purposes of God. That's the first lesson. Here's the second lesson that comes from Abraham and this moment in his life. The greatest enemy to our fear, or to our faith, I beg your pardon, the greatest enemy to our faith is our fear. Old President Franklin Roosevelt once said this. He said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. You see, fear can be a friend to faith when one lets fear strengthen our faith. But when one gives in to fear, it will overcome our faith. And this text today reveals how Abraham gave in to fear and how fear caused his faith to falter. First thing to notice is that if we do not overcome with faith and walking in that faith, fear begins to speak louder than God does. I'll say that again. If we do not overcome in our faith, fear will begin to speak louder than God's voice does. And in verse 10, we are told that on the account of the famine in the land, Abram decides to leave the place where God told him to go, and he decides to go to Egypt. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a wise thing to do. But when I took a closer look at this verse, I noticed something that is missing here. Something that's missing. We know from previous encounters with the Lord that the Lord brought Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldeans with his father Terah. We know from verse 1 of chapter 12 that it was the Lord again who commanded Abram to leave Haran and go to Canaan. And he was obedient and listening to the voice of the Lord. And that's what's missing here on this journey to Egypt. Where's the voice of the Lord? It's not there. The absence of God speaking to Abraham is no coincidence. The absence of the voice of God reveals that Abram was letting his fear speak louder than his faith and his trust in God. Abram's fears were speaking to him. Will God really take care of me? Is God going to honor his promises? Is God going to bless me like he said he would? These fears and doubts began to chip away at his trust in God. Abram's fears would begin to overshadow the very promises of God, because when fear begins to speak louder than God, it distorts our vision and we lose sight of what God wants us to do and where he wants us to be. Note, secondly, fear causes us to take things into our own hands. Not only does it mute the voice of God, but it causes us to try and sort things out ourselves. On account of Abraham listening to his fears instead of having faith, he decides to take the initiative in this part of his journey instead of following God's initial initiative. The beginning of this new section, Abram is leaving for Egypt, and we see him taking the initiative to go down there. It says he went down to Egypt and lived there, or stayed there, or sojourned there. This wasn't God's initiative, this was Abraham taking things into his own hand. Abram's sojourning in Egypt was a clear indication that Abram was operating on his own terms and not God's terms. Now, there are a few times in the Bible where we see the Lord commanding or allowing his people to go to Egypt. We see this truth with Jacob, for instance, and Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus. But for most part, when Egypt is mentioned in the Bible, it usually refers to that which is of this world and that we shouldn't go near it. When Egypt is used in this sense, it often refers to that which God's people are told to avoid or give allegiance to. In other words, don't go anywhere near Egypt. It's the stuff of heathens. It's the stuff that will destroy you. It's the stuff of the flesh. But where does Abraham go? Egypt. He decides to rely on human resources, in other words, rather than trusting in God. And so often when we, as God's people, find ourselves in Egypt, it's because our faith has faltered. We take things into our own hands and we forget about trusting God and his divine resources. There are times when we need to capture this principle of not letting fear overcome the voice of the Lord in our lives, and don't tune out from what God is asking us to do. Why? Because we'll take stuff into our own hands. Here's the third principle. Fear causes us to do things in the flesh. Abram here is acting apart from God, without any trust in God's ability to protect him. Fear of a famine, and it caused Abram to falter in his faith. God's ability to provide him with his daily sustenance was no longer in Abraham's heart or mind. It was fear of the Egyptians that caused Abram's faith to falter and God's ability to protect him from his dangers. So what does Abram do? He starts to scheme and deceive for protecting the purposes of his own life. Notice the conversation that takes place between Abraham and Sarah just before they get into Egypt. And it came about when he came to Egypt, he said to Sarah's wife, "You're a very beautiful woman, and it will come about when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they'll kill me, and they'll let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well with me, and I may live on account of you." Now, there are several different understandings of how Abram knew that the Egyptians would kill him on the account of Sarah, but we don't need to get into that this morning in any detail. Enough to know this. At this point in his experience, Abram was trying to buy time and protect himself. He would decide to deceive the Egyptians by telling them a half-truth. At this point in Abram's experience, walk with God, it had finally got to the point it was all about him. He had got to the all about me self-preservation moment in his life. He wanted it to go well with him. He didn't want to die, therefore he took things into his own hands and made a plan he thought would bring protection to him and also help the Lord maybe out a bit by keeping his promises that he had eventually given to Abraham. But we all know his plan wouldn't work. It would fail. Why? Abram was incorrect in thinking he would have enough time to negotiate with the Egyptians. And it was this false calculation that put both his life and his wife and his family in danger. And although Abraham experienced blessings bestowed upon him from Pharaoh, cattle, sheep, goats, all sorts of material blessings, and although he got those blessings, here's the important thing to remember: they were not divine blessings. Instead, they were blessings that came about through human initiative. In the case of Abram, now watch this, yes, he prospered materially, but by the time he got to this point, he was spiritually poor. He was spiritually poor. He had left a physical famine and found himself in a spiritual famine. A famine that came upon him on the basis of his faltering faith, because he didn't trust the Lord, his God, to take care of him. What lessons to learn in our walk with God this morning? If we give in to fear, we'll end up in the same situation as Abram did. Maybe he's still prospering physically, materially, prospering in our society and culture here, perhaps even. But what a loss to get to that point, but miss out on the voice of God, or miss out on the spiritual blessings that we can accrue. Lesson number 3, and I hope this is encouraging you this morning, challenging you. But then notice something else in our lesson. When our faith falters, God does not. When our faith falters, God does not. In verses 17 through the rest of the chapter, we see a faithful Lord intervening, even though Abraham and his faith has faltered. It says these wonderful words, but the Lord. Isn't that brilliant? You're in some sort of situation or circumstance you don't understand. Everything seems to be going wrong. You wonder, why, Lord, have you got me in this place? Maybe even you walk away from God at times and say, Lord, I don't understand anymore. I'm giving up. I'm tired. And then get these words, but the Lord. Anybody ever been there when the Lord has stepped in? Those 3 words are a declaration of God's unfailing faithfulness to you and to me. In fact, this story of Abram's faltering faith is more about a faithful God than it is about a faithful servant or faithless servant. Through Abram's faltering faith, we would see him jeopardize the promises of God. But God's faithfulness to his word and his promises would ensure that he would always see Abram through and fulfill the promises he had given to his servant. And we see God's faithfulness revealed back to Abram in 3 different ways. And we'll close up with this morning before we conclude our little study. First thing we see is God's faithfulness to intervene and then discipline Abram's faltering faith. Listen to it. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Look, if we are tempted in any way to think that the Lord approves of Abram's behavior, then these verses through 17, 19 should dispel any such notions. God was not pleased. Abram left one challenging circumstance, but he pushed himself into another. It would seem that trouble was on the horizon. Abram was helpless to save his wife, Sarah, but God was not. And God stepped into that situation in spite of Abraham's faltering faith. God intervened by first bringing discipline upon Pharaoh and then by using Pharaoh to discipline Abram's faltering faith. We are told in verse 17 that the Lord struck Pharaoh in his house with some plague or disease. And the Lord revealed to Pharaoh that Sarah was Abraham's wife. And as a result, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with these plagues. Pharaoh then calls Abram to him and begins to rebuke him and discipline him for his faltering faith. But don't think for a moment that the source of the rebuke is Pharaoh alone. It is the Lord here using Pharaoh to rebuke his servant and straighten out his pathway again. Twice Pharaoh asked Abram why he lied to him. This rebuke is indicative of just how far out of fellowship Abram was at that moment. Before Abram left for Egypt, the Lord was speaking to him personally. He heard the voice of God. The Lord was appearing to him in person. Abraham was worshiping and calling continually upon the name of the Lord his God. But in Egypt, the Lord is silent, worship is absent, and the Lord has to use an ungodly man to set his servant straight. This rebuke on the part of Pharaoh and ultimately on the part of the Lord is God's faithfulness to discipline his straying children. Listen, folks, when God steps in and starts to discipline us, don't balk at it. Don't get angry about it. Don't get mad at God. Most times when God steps in and has to discipline us, he's straightening us out so we get back on the road again and our faith is sustained and God begins and wants to pour out more blessings into our lives in his plan and his will and his purpose. He knows that Abram's faith is faltering, but he steps in there in his love and mercy and disciplines him to straighten him up and get him back on the road with God. And then verse 20 shows us that not only is the Lord faithful to discipline, but when he's done that, then he's faithful to restore and deliver. Come on, anybody glad that maybe he had to discipline you, had to straighten you out, but when he did, well, he was ready to deliver you and start to bless you again. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. Amazing. Abram puts himself and his wife in a predicament, one that could bring harm on all of them, but the Lord delivers them all out of it totally unharmed. This is God's faithfulness to those who are his children. And the final observation we notice about God's faithfulness when faith is faltering is found in the first 4 verses of chapter 13 that we read this morning. And so Abram went up from Egypt to Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. He was by that time very rich in livestock and silver and gold. He went on his journey from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where a tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. What's taking place here? God's taken back to a place of restoration, back to a place where he encountered and had that special relationship with God, back to a place of blessing and honor and glory. He went back as far as Bethel, to the house of God. Abram went back to where he was in the beginning before his faith faltered. And God was faithful to forgive Abraham's faith and direct him into full fellowship again. Abraham had come full circle in his walk with God. His faith at one point faltered and led him away, stopped him from worshiping God, but God called him back. The Lord is faithful, and he takes him back to the place of his glory, back to the presence of the Lord. Let me sum up in a couple of paragraphs. Is anybody here going through a time of testing? Anybody going through a trial that makes it difficult to cling to God? Anybody finding it difficult to live the faith life at the moment? Are you facing some famine situation in your life today? Have you been walking with God and suddenly that challenge comes up, that experience arrives in your life, and you're in that moment of famine when all seems to be falling away? Are you tempted to escape your famine by fleeing to Egypt like Abram did? Try and sort it out yourself. Sometimes we can find some temporary relief in doing those things, but the price we will pay is more than we should ever want to pay. And I want to encourage each of us this morning to remain in the promised land that God has brought us to at this moment in our experience with him. That even in times of famine, we do not allow our fears to overcome our faith, and we listen intently to the voice of God and don't try and mess and sort stuff out ourselves. When those trials come like they did for Abram, when life gets hard, so hard that sometimes we don't understand, we've just got to hold tightly to God saying, I trust you, Lord. I know you will see me through this experience. I will stay right here with you and not wander off somewhere else. I will endure the famine if I have to, because I know ultimately if you have to, you'll feed me on the manna of the fruits of the Spirit of God, just like you did your people before. I will worship you at this altar. I'll not be moved from where my trust is in you and go and worship somewhere else. I'll stay fixed to the altar that you've brought me to in the house of the Lord. And when we do that, then we can rest in the joy of a God who is a loving, gracious, wonderful Heavenly Father. And we'll see the greatness of his loving heart. And when we do that, God's beauty will fill our souls. And through God's transforming, saving, keeping power, even through the trials and challenges of life, we'll continue to grow in living the faith life and walking with God. Couple of things. Realize, firstly, that everyone faces famines. Everybody faces famines. Perhaps the famine that strikes you is bad news from the doctor, or a broken relationship, or the death of a loved one, or employment, or bankruptcy, who knows? But we all face our famines. It's in those moments the question comes, who do we really trust in? Who do we really trust in? While our famines are fearsome and sometimes even destructive, remember they provide an opportunity to prove God. And not only to find blessing in trusting Him, but to glorify His name. Secondly, we must realize that everybody like Abraham struggles with weakness. And for most of us, we struggle with more than just one weakness, if we're honest. Everyone, including the good and the godly, have our share of imperfections and flaws. These weaknesses can cause us to make unwise choices. But it's in those unwise choices we have to realize again that to overcome them, it's just about getting close to God again, about leaning on Him. Not feeling sorry for yourself, not trying to blame somebody else, just get back to God, get back to Bethel, go back to that moment and that experience and that encounter with God. And thirdly, we must realize that when we do compromise on our faith, it jeopardizes every other aspect of our lives and relationships. Whatever we revert to do, our default response in trying to handle it out ourselves or work it out ourselves, somebody will get hurt, usually the ones who are closest to us. Our lives consist of relationships arranged in concentric circles, and the more we mess with that and try to do it on our own, those circles spread out, and we just cause more damage and destruction. But we have a God this morning who, if we're willing to turn to Him, can start pulling those circles back in again and begin to heal and restore. Stand with me, church, as the singers and musicians come. I hope this simple message this morning has encouraged you to go on and live the life of faith. We're all going to falter, just like Abram did. It's inevitable because of our humanity. But a loving God this morning reaches out to you and He says, even in those moments of faltering, even in those moments when you fail me, even in those moments when you walk away and turn to your own devices or look to Egypt, God says, but my hand is still in your life. Aren't you thankful for God's hand in your life this morning? He's been so good to you and to me already. Been so good. I call you faithful for the promises you've kept and every need you've met. Lord, I'm so grateful you were with me every step, and I will never forget. When I think of how you've blessed me, how your hand has never let me go, you have been so good to me. God, I can't believe how you love me. What a friend you have been. What words of comfort this morning. The words of that song continue. For every morning, for every open door, I call you faithful. Come on, how many doors has God opened for you this morning? How many times has He not led you somewhere that's brought you back into blessing and favor? And then for every mountain, for every time you've brought me through. Anybody had to climb a mountain someday? And you feel you can't get to the top, and then you just feel the arms of the shepherd around you. And He carries you to the top of the mountain, back into the presence of His love. For your forgiveness, for how you've never turned away. Come on this morning, church. There's not one of us sitting here this morning shouldn't be bursting with praise because of the forgiveness of God, His mercy, His love, His restoration. And for your salvation, for the price that I couldn't pay, you were willing to pay. And as we worship Him this morning and thank Him for His goodness, and gather around these emblems that show us again the sacrifice that was made, His broken body, the shedding of His precious blood. Let's remember He's been so good. And even when we falter this morning, let's turn to Him and be pulled closer to God and sustained and strengthened in our faith.